Hello, do I look shaggy? I just came back from a big trip around the Pacific Northwest. I was crisscrossing it in my car, visiting various friends and family members who I haven't seen in a very long time, years and years and years, frankly. Along the way, I did the thing that I like to do, which is to shop for used books, both at relatively mainstream establishments like Half Price Books and Powell's, but also lots of local indie bookstores, because I like to read and collect books, but most of the books that I like are not available at Barnes & Noble. I just have this huge mental list. I want to read this book and I want to read this book, and it's gotten very long over the years, and I'm always adding stuff onto it. Over the course of a few weeks, I went to 28 bookstores and I purchased 208 books. At first, I was like, this will be fun to talk about on a video. The more books I bought, the more embarrassed I became by the prospect. I was like, oh no, everyone is going to judge me and my spending habits. But doing a cursory little glance around, I came to realize that common booktube content. Sup YouTube, I just bought 200 books from Barnes & Noble. Here they are right now, right? So I guess I feel a little less bad about that. Most of these books I am buying for $1 to $5. Some of the really rare ones, like some of the Ballantines, I'm generally spending around $10 to $15 for. And then the most I paid for any one book was $40. By having an upper limit for myself, I'm not buying any $100 book, right? Because I think that book looks amazing, but I can probably find it cheaper someday somewhere else. There's three ways I really could have made this video. I could have done little vlogs of me in the bookstores while thrifting. I don't think I really have the temperament for that. Like whenever I went with friends and whatnot, they wouldn't really want to be on camera anyway. And B, when I am shopping for books, there is nothing more deeply annoying than somebody making content and disturbing my book shopping experience. The second way I could have done this, and I did start doing this at first, was to record vlogs on the scene. I actually did record a few videos in some pretty gorgeous environments talking about the books I found that day. But ultimately, I realized that I just would not have enough time to block 1 to 2 hours out of every day talking about these books. And ultimately, I figured that it would just be easier for me to talk about it right here. I have already sorted all the books, categorized them, I know what to talk about. This is what we are going to do. This is actually going to be multiple episodes in one, where I am going to talk about the different books I found in chunks, and I'm going to record them in chunks. And most importantly, you at home can watch them in chunks. You can watch half an hour, take a break, and then maybe some other time you can watch the next segment. I would rather have all this be one video so that it doesn't clog up my feed. Then you have it all in one place. Everyone wins. Part 1. I will be talking about all the Ballantine adult fantasies I got, as well as adjacent works to those. If you're not familiar, Ballantine Adult Fantasy was an imprint of Ballantine Books, where Lynn Carter curated and republished lots of rare and interesting fantasy novels from the early to mid 20th century, and also the late 19th century, I guess I should add, as well as a couple of contemporary books that kind of lined up with that theming. But besides that, it's all these old school books, many of which you really can't find in any edition besides the Ballantine in the first place. Who is going to find this William Morris book from 1885? It's much easier to find this relatively rare but still findable paperback from the 70s. And anyway, Ballantines are cool. I found a lot of them. I found 27 which means I have gone from having 1/3 of all Ballantines to about 2/3 of all Ballantines, which is a huge leap. I thought this was a search that would take me years and years. Each one of these books is going to have a better cover than anything you have ever seen published in the last 15 years. They look so good. It's incredible. I don't know why we can't have good covers anymore. Number 1, Hrolf Kraki's Saga by Poul Anderson. Poul Anderson wrote The Broken Sword, which I think is one of the greatest fantasy novels of all time. This grim, dark analog to Tolkien, the grit and the bloodshed that Tolkien would not. And then similarly, Hrolf Kraki's Saga is, I believe, him trying to do his own Icelandic saga. This is based off of the life of a real guy, Hrolf Kraki. Of Hrolf Kraki's Saga, if you can't guess. I don't know if it's as supernatural as The Broken Sword. I bet it's good. Orlando Furioso. Ariosto's Immortal Classic in a New English Translation by Richard Hodgins. Orlando Furioso is one of the great epic poems of Italy. This 16th century epic poem that is stupidly long about this guy who is an analog of Roland, the iconic knight of French literature. They are mostly medieval, down to earth, but then there will be hippogriffs and stuff. The problem is that this is Orlando Furioso Part 1. Basically, the adult fantasy line ended before they ever translated the rest. So this is just a one and done. That book that I just held up is not to be confused with Ariosto by Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, another famous fantasy novel where she is writing about the poet of Orlando Furioso, who is himself going on fantasy adventures. The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This is a pre-Ballantine Ballantine. This was published immediately after Lord of the Rings, and so it was before they had officially designated the Ballantine adult fantasy line. So most copies of The Last Unicorn in this original Ballantine edition do not have the unicorn colophon you can see on all of these other books. Problem is, this isn't actually an original Ballantine. This is a Del Rey re-release of the Ballantine edition. The cover is so beautiful, but it is technically not a real Ballantine. The girl told me that all Del Reys were bad. Oh no, Del Rey ruined literature. Beyond the Golden Stair by Hans Bach. He was a deeply influential fantasy illustrator in the 1970s, and he wrote all of 2 books, and this is the more obscure one. I know nothing about this book, but because Ballantine released it, it's now on my radar. So maybe I'll do a video on it one day. We can find out what it's all about together. I have 2 books by James Branch Cabell, The Cream of the Jest and The High Place. James Branch Cabell was writing in the 1920s, I believe. All of his books fall into this big meta series called The Biography of Manuel, which covers multiple generations of this aristocratic family. These novels are highly satirical about different facets of society and about religion. His most famous novel, called Jürgen, which is also part of this series, got him charged with obscenity in 1919. And so there was a huge court case about that. And interestingly enough, even though Jürgen is his most famous novel, it is not published in the Ballantine line, probably because it's too horny. This one is not a Ballantine adult fantasy. The Ancient Engineers by L. Sprague de Camp, who was one of the great pulp writers of the mid-20th century. I have over here the Del Rey. Del Rey is bad. No, I have the Del Rey of The Complete Enchanter, which he wrote with fellow Ballantine laureate Fletcher Pratt. This is their most famous adventure. This is multiple books in one, which is why it's The Complete Enchanter. I think the last book in the series is actually a parody of Orlando Furioso. So now I can understand what this parody is all about. Good golly, Miss Molly. Anyway, back to L. Sprague de Camp. So this is a Ballantine. It's not a Ballantine adult fantasy because this is a non-fiction book. This is a non-fiction book just about how people of ancient times built the pyramids and whatnot. L. Sprague de Camp seems to have had a second career of writing about the ancient world. I've found several of his ancient history books. He's done some historical fiction as well, and so it's really interesting to find those books out in the wild. Another bonus that doesn't really quite count, Miscellany Gate by E.R. Edison. I already own all 4 of the Ballantines for E.R. Edison's Worm Ouroboros and its follow-up Zaramvian trilogy. But for fun and profit, I am also collecting these late 70s Del Rey editions. And now I'm just missing A Fish Dinner in Mnemosyne. This was my biggest score. I found all the Lord Dunsany's that Ballantine ever did. I already owned King of Elfland's Daughter. Now I have everything else, and they published a lot by Lord Dunsany. Lord Dunsany, if you don't know, is the most important fantasy author of the generation immediately preceding Tolkien's. So he really set a lot of the stage so that Tolkien could flourish. And he was mostly writing in the 1920s, 1930s. We got 2 of his novels, Don Rodriguez, Chronicles of Shadow Valley, as well as The Charwoman's Shadow. And I think a lot of these books actually kind of take place in Renaissance Spain or something, which is so interesting because he's not normally associated with that, right? I also picked up 3 of his short story collections, Beyond the Fields We Know, Over the Hills and Far Away, At the Edge of the World. This has the entirety of The Gods of Pegana in it, which I recommended in my top 15 fantasy video. The World's Desire by H. Rider Haggard. This cover is insane. Actually, the craziest, most psychedelic cover I've ever seen. I am obsessed with it. Maybe I'll make this the thumbnail for the video, if I can find a high-res copy of it. H. Rider Haggard was writing a lot in the 1870s or whatever. He is most famous for inventing the character of Alan Quatermain in King Solomon's Mines. You remember Alan Quatermain, right? He was played by Sean Connery in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Remember how good that movie was? Well, the comic's good. I did read the Alan Moore comic when I was in middle school, and let me tell you, that's not a comic for middle schoolers. You like superheroes, read this. And then there's just some crazy stuff that happens in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that scarred me for years. Last year, actually, this is a tangent, I read a lot of deep cut Alan Moore stuff. I've read most of his famous works at this point, and Promethea is amazing, dude. Promethea is the craziest thing I have ever read. Anyway, we're talking about H. Rider Haggard. H. Rider Haggard wrote King Solomon's Mines. In inventing the character of Alan Quatermain, he basically invented the Indiana Jones archetype. The type of adventure novel where you're going to a lost city and you're finding a treasure and there's an ancient civilization there that you've never heard of. But the thing is, because all these ancient civilizations and whatnot he's always writing about are in the deepest jungles of Africa. These books are probably gently racist at the minimum. Like I said, without these books, Indiana Jones would not exist. So I did buy King Solomon's Mines as well as his other most famous non-Alan Quatermain novel, She, which is about an adventurer who comes across a lost kingdom in Africa. Oh, they have a goddess, and the goddess is white. How could this have happened? There's probably going to be lots of problematic stuff in there. I did also get the Ballantine for The World's Desire, which I had never heard of this book, but this is his sequel to the Odyssey. This is about Odysseus after the death of his wife, long after the events of the Odyssey, going out on one last voyage. And I think he's mostly hanging out in Egypt in this book because H. Rider Haggard is incapable of writing a book that doesn't take place in Africa. I almost forgot. I got one more H. Rider Haggard. Cleopatra H. Rider Haggard's internationally famous novel of an Egyptian queen who was a snake emoji, woman of flame, snake emoji. The snake emojis are there. I'm not making them up. Once again, dude is really fascinated with Africa. This is not a Ballantine adult fantasy, but this was published by Ballantine at the same time. I think this was published in 1971, but this was just a generic Ballantine book. The Sadik of Seven Wonders. The first Yiddish science fantasy novel ever. And here's the thing. They say the first Yiddish science fantasy novel. The novel wasn't originally written in Yiddish, it was written in English, but they're just saying it's very culturally Jewish, right? In a very 1970s New York sort of way. David McCall Johnson, this is the same cover artist as the guy who did most of the Evangeline Walton Mabinogians. This is a time travel novel about a dude who is going through different periods of Jewish history. The premise intrigued me, but looking at the reviews, I think everyone agrees that it's kind of mid. Unless you are ingratiated enough in Jewish culture to like understand a lot of the hyper-specific references. The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson. What a real Hieronymus Bosch of a cover, right? William Hope Hodgson is one of the progenitors of weird fiction right before H.P. Lovecraft, I think, or maybe they were kind of contemporary. He is most known for his book House on the Borderland, which blends science fiction, fantasy, and horror together. That's the definition of weird fiction. And so he is also famous for The Nightland, which is about a dude who goes to this alternate Dark Souls realm and then fights demons with a chainsaw gun or something. It's apparently crazy. I also got his third most famous novel, The Boats of the Glen Carrig. This does have a Ballantine edition, so hopefully I can find that someday. Quintessential haunted ship. Ooh, boats are spooky! And so if you like Curse of the Obra Dinn, this seems to be the type of book for you. Delany Checkmate by Katherine Kurtz. Katherine Kurtz was one of the only authors who got new novels published under the Ballantine adult fantasy label. This is her original trilogy based off of medieval Wales. But I didn't mention her in my Mabinogian video because it's a very different type of medieval Wales. Post-Christian. Delany has like monasteries and saints and whatnot. I do want to make a video about Katherine Kurtz sooner rather than later. I own it already in the late 70s Ballantine editions, but I need the early 70s Ballantine editions. Excalibur by Sanders Ann Lobenthal. Sanders Ann Lobenthal was a woman who didn't really write that many fantasy novels. Folks from Arthurian Britain are invading modern day Mobile, Alabama. And so you have all these Alabamans who are like, we need to find Excalibur so that we can fight off these people. H.P. Lovecraft, The Doom That Came to Sarnath. So yes, there is some H.P. Lovecraft in the Ballantine line, but it's mostly his more fantasy aligned stuff like, what's it called? Like The Dream Quest of Kadath. This cover's okay. I have two of George MacDonald's novels, Phantastes, which is often credited as the first modern fantasy novel, which he wrote in like 1860s. So he wrote this at the beginning of his career. George MacDonald is also famous for writing The Princess and the Goblin. Princess and the Goblin, great children's fantasy stories, turned into an absolutely insane animated film in the 80s, which I watched all the time in high school with me and my bros. Princess Irene! Where are you? I'm looking for Curdy. Where are you, Curdy? Don't worry, I don't remember how Curdy talks. Anyway, that movie's awesome, dude. Princess and the Goblin, you can guess. Like, there is a princess, and she is kidnapped by goblins. And then eventually, the main kid, who is like the butcher's boy or something, realizes that the goblins don't like song. So every time he sings, the goblins are like, oh no, stop that horrible noise. And so he sings this song, but he only has like one song. So they sing this one song like 17 times in the movie. There's a light in every heart. Anyway, at the end of his career, George MacDonald wrote another novel. He was writing consistently. I've read Lilith. I haven't read Fantasties. I've read Lilith, which is this truly bizarre portal fantasy religious allegory about a guy going into this mirror realm and sort of fighting a demoness called Lilith. But there is lots of truly bizarre and morbid religious world building in there that is so weird that I genuinely think it's a good read even if you're not religious. George MacDonald, highly religious person. I think he was like a Christian pastor by trade. If you can't guess, his work was very influential to C.S. Lewis. I also have 2 small press editions that I have found of various George MacDonald stories with beautiful covers, the Grey Wolf and other fantasy stories, as well as the Wise Wolf and other fantasy stories. These are 2 of 4, so now I'm like, oh no, do I need to find these other 2 small press editions one day? Uh-oh. The Three Imposters by Arthur Machen. This is the book I paid the most for, by the way. I paid $40 for this because I was like, where else on earth am I going to find this? Arthur Machen was a weird / horror fantasy writer, mostly operating in, I think, like the 1890s or something. He is most famous for the novella The Great God Pan, which is this excellent short little horror read. So he's known for that. But this is a different book he wrote that I don't know anything about, but it's published by Ballantines. Wow, there's a pull quote from James Branch Cabell on the back, and a pull quote by H.P. Lovecraft. The interesting thing about all these early 20th century writers is that they're all reading each other, right? And they all respect each other. The Shaving of Shagpat by George Meredith. I don't know much about George Meredith, but this is a novel written in the same vein as The Arabian Nights. A satirical, Arabic-styled fantasy novel, probably progressive by the standards of the 1940s or whatever, and it's probably a little racist today. We'll see. Okay, this one is crazy. The Fates of the Princes of Diffid by Kenneth Morris. A Newcastle Forgotten Fantasy. This is a book I mentioned in my Evangeline Walton video, where this is one of the few guys who was doing Mabinogian themed fantasy before Evangeline Walton was. It's just like such a rare book that I honestly didn't think I'd ever find it. But then I found it, and I also discovered the Newcastle Forgotten Fantasy line, which I looked into. And this is a line from the late 70s, which had the premise of, we are going to publish all of the works that are even more obscure and less talked about than the Ballantine editions. So it's mostly a lot of H. Rider Haggard and William Morris, but then there's just like a couple of other things that you're like, what? I have never heard of this before. It even says on the back, Celtic mythology has provided a wealth of inspiration for fantasy writers, from Lord Dunsany and E.R. Edison through Robert E. Howard, Tolkien, Evangeline Walton, Catherine Kurtz, and Lloyd Alexander. That's it. The gang's all here. All your favorite authors. All my favorite authors, at least. Okay, here's a big gun. William Morris, who I have mentioned earlier. One of the most influential people in late 19th century England. He helped spearhead the crafts movement. And then on top of that, he was a influential fantasy author. He is like so influential, but very few people today have read his works. I don't really have a beachhead with which to talk about him. Speaking of which, I did find 2 more William Morris books that weren't Ballantines, but Newcastle Forgotten Fantasies. We have Child Christopher and Goldolin the Fair, as well as Golden Wings and Other Stories. Merlin's Ring by H. Warner Munn. This is actually not a Ballantine, but it also is. This was meant to be a Ballantine adult fantasy, and then the plug got pulled on the line. Lynn Carter put out 2 last books that were supposed to be part of the Ballantine line, and still get counted with them when we're talking about Ballantines, which is this, as well as Prince of Anoon by Evangeline Walton. Merlin's Ring is actually the third in a trilogy, but only this one is part of the Ballantine line, and this is sort of a Arthurian epic that goes over the span of thousands of years. I did luckily find the first two books, which were packaged together under the title Merlin's Godson, which is a early 70s Ballantine book that's not part of the adult fantasy line. So that's neat. We got the Tolkiens. I was able to find basically all of the non-Lord of the Rings stuff. The Tolkien Reader, lots of miscellaneous Tolkien works. Smith of Wootton Major and Farmer Giles of Ham, which are two of Tolkien's storybook, fairy tale novellas. And then finally, Tolkien, A Look Behind Lord of the Rings by Lynn Carter. This is just Lynn Carter writing. These are different concepts from Lord of the Rings and different inspirations. And here's a dictionary and whatnot. Because in the 1970s, you didn't have Wikipedia. You didn't have those resources. Before the Silmarillion, mind you, would have been really helpful back then. Though speaking of which, I did also pick up a Ballantine copy of the Silmarillion just for fun. This is a late 70s copy, and there's late 70s Ballantine Lord of the Rings that this corresponds with. They always have a place on the front, and I don't have those, but I just thought, why not? It was $2 or something. It never hurts to have more Silmarillions. 3 final books. Discoveries in Fantasy, edited by Lynn Carter, and Great Short Novels of Adult Fantasy, Volume 2, edited by Lynn Carter. So this has lots of miscellaneous works and authors that don't really have their own space. This has Ernest Bramah in it, who was writing Chinese-inspired fantasy in the early 20th century. I don't recognize the other authors, Richard Garnett, Donald Corley, Eden Philpotts. This has, The Woman in the Mirror by George MacDonald, which seems to maybe be a excerpt of Lilith. The Repairer of Reputations by Robert W. Chambers. Oh, that one's awesome. Chambers is the guy who wrote The King in Yellow. Repairer of Reputations is a story from The King of Yellow. That's the one that has the suicide boots from Futurama. The Transmutation of Ling. Oh, that's another Ernest Bramah. And then The Lavender Dragon by Eden Philpotts. I've never heard the name Eden Philpotts before, so maybe I should look into that more. And then finally, this isn't a Ballantine, but it sort of seems to fit the vibe of all these other books. Songs and Sonnets Atlantean by Donald S. Fryer. This was published in the early 70s. It seems to be a guy trying to write more fantasy poetry in the same vein as Clark Ashton Smith. Very inspired by Edmund Spenser, writer of The Fairy Queen. He posits that this is a translation of poems originally written in Atlantean. And I don't know how much he sticks to that conceit, because he is referencing Clark Ashton Smith and Edmund Spenser and all these authors that, if you can guess it, lived after the sinking of Atlantis. All right, consider that episode 1. Anyway, I'll talk to you later. Hello, I am back for part 2 of this little video. I changed my shirt to make it visually distinct. I just thrifted this recently because I wanted to look like Kazuma Kiryu. This section is called GOATs, which is to say greatest of all time. These are just authors who I really appreciate, who I just try to pick up as much of their work as I can, often because it's on the rare side. Before I get into that, I just want to say that I realized that I do not have a VHS tape up here. I forgot that's a thing I started doing. I put a little VHS tape up here for fun and profit. That's tied into the video somehow. But fortunately, I have The Princess and the Goblin. See, okay, here's Princess Irene, and there's Curdy, and that's the Goblin Prince, and that's his overbearing mother. I honestly don't remember what she sounds like, but it's probably like, "My worthless son, you gotta go kidnap that princess." And he's like, "Mother!" Great pull quote on the back. I absolutely loved it. It says, Mara Medved. the 7-year-old daughter of New York Post critic Michael Medved. Now, isn't that adorable? They should do that more often. First up, Ursula K. Le Guin. I have like a smattering of Le Guin. I have most of the Heinishes, I have most of the Earthseas, but I don't collect her religiously. Very far away from anywhere else, a different kind of love story. But it seems to be a bit of a platonic love story between two teenagers. It's sort of a coming-of-age young adult novel. And I guess I was vaguely aware that she wrote stuff like this, but I had never seen it, in the field before, so I purchased it, even though it's so small. Look how thin this bad boy is. I bet it's less than 100 pages. It's 86 pages long. Unbelievable. Next up is The Language of the Night. Essays on fantasy and science fiction. Wait a second. M dashes. Did she write all this with ChatGPT? I'm kidding. Wait, what the I just opened up this book and I see Evangeline Walton, whose books like Kenneth Morris's are reworkings of the Mabinogion, has achieved her own beautifully idiosyncratic blend of humor and heroism. There is no doubt that the Celtic mythos lends itself to such a purpose. Wow! Just open up to a random page and she's praising Evangeline Walton. I did not plan this. I have never opened up this book before. That is so cool. Anyway, Ursula K. Le Guin is so smart. She can be really grouchy, and it's fun to read her go off on someone. Was it Kazuo Ishiguro? When The Berry Giant came out, everyone was like, this isn't your ordinary fantasy novel. This is actually kind of literary. And she's like, fuck off. I hate all of you. Fantasy's good, and fantasy's always been good. But those are the only two Le Guins I have. Next up, let's do another short one. Janny Wurts, one of my absolute faves. Greatest epic fantasy writer, in my opinion. I picked up this brick. You could kill someone in this if you were playing Clue. This is the final book in the Wars of Light and Shadow, which just came out 1 year ago. I already own this in hardcover, but that's because they didn't even have a mass market paperback yet. But I have the other 10 books in mass market paperback, so I thought, why not? I want to support Janny Wurts because she's so good. She's so good and not enough people read her considering how much better she is than like anyone else writing right now. Did pick up the trade paperback. I don't know if there's a mass market for this one, of To Ride Hell's Chasm. This is her only Wars of Light and Shadow book that she has written in the last 30 years. I think this came out in 2001 or 2002. Apparently really good. I mean, surprise, surprise. And this is also the only Janny Wurts book that I did not own. So now I have every single thing she's ever written. And, I'm about halfway through her bibliography and I can't wait to read the rest. I also want to say that Song of the Mysteries going back, this cover is by Janny Wurts. She's done the covers for every single War of Light and Shadow book, both in the old style where they had paintings of Erathon and Lycera on the cover, and then the new and iconic covers, which I generally don't like as much because I just want people to be on my covers, but this is still like such a gorgeous cover and she did a great job with it. Okay, I got 2 R.A. Laffertys, which aren't that many, but R.A. Lafferty is so hard to find at all. The Devil is Dead by R.A. Lafferty. This might be the same dude who did that In the Nightland cover. And then I also got Arrive at Easter Wine, and this seems to be like an absurdly psychedelic cover. Have no idea. The Autobiography of a Chistic Machine. R.A. Lafferty, the only writer we know who can write rings around himself, is thoroughly at home as an interpreter of the 4 or 5-dimensional character that emerges from the birth of Epic. Cool. Neat. We have some Samuel R. Delany. I haven't actually read that much Samuel R. Delany, but he is such a master and one who is kind of out of print by modern standards that whenever I just see one of his old sci-fi novels, I just pick it up. And I kind of have most everything at this point. The Ballad of Beta 2, I just bought it because it was $1. And then they used to do this a lot. You flip it over and it's a different novel. Alpha, yes. Terra, no, by Emile Petitjean. I might give this to a friend because I actually already have a copy of Ballad of Beta 2, but I just thought it was a really fun cover. It's very pulp SF. And then these last two were the only pre-90s Delaney's that I don't have. 60s, 70s, 80s sci-fi. They're difficult and they're literary, but they're also popularly acclaimed, which is a rare balance. The last 30 years of his career has mostly been writing very literary gay erotica, which is like good. I actually have one of them right here. Phallos. It's an internet review of a fictional ancient Greek erotica novel. Oh, did I even say who like Samuel R. Delany is? To people who are in sci-fi, he needs no introduction. For people who aren't as familiar with him, he is one of the most consistently beloved and critically acclaimed sci-fi writers of the last 50 years, but he is also a gay black man. Crazy to think about, right? Just like in the 1960s, that a gay black man is like winning all of these Nebulas and Hugos. In the current climate, which really appreciates, you know, these sort of breakthroughs in diversity, I should be able to buy him at Barnes & Noble, guys. That's all I'm saying, if you really care so much. But I did pick up two novels by him. One is Triton, an ambiguous heterotopia, as he called it. This is a response to Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which was subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia. And then I've been looking for this everywhere for years and years and years. Dahlgren. This copy's pretty beat up, has like a bunch of stains on it, but I don't care. Dahlgren is his magnum opus. It's 900 pages long. It's a novel that is famously hard to describe, even when you've read it, right? And I haven't read it, but it's about a guy who is going through this weird abandoned city and having adventures, but he's like deeply unreliable. He may or may not be schizophrenic. You never quite know what's going on. Maybe the single most difficult mainstream science fiction book ever written. And so it's intimidating, but I want to try it. Okay, next up is my girl, Joanna Russ. Picnic on Paradise, which was her very first novel. It's a sci-fi novel about this woman named Alex. After I picked it up, I did also purchase The Adventures of Alex, which has the original Picnic on Paradise novella, and then it has 4 more adventures. Extraordinary People, one of her short story collections. I have her other short story collection, The Zanzibar Cat, The Female Man, but like an actual copy of it. The Female Man I had before was the SF Masterworks release, which is like the easy way to buy it. I'll just say it. SF Masterworks is fugly. Those covers are so hideous. And then the banana yellow spine, ugh. It looks horrible on a shelf. This is the Beacon Press Books edition. Don't get me wrong, this cover is also ugly, but it's ugly in a way that is awesome. Joanna Russ's great text on how rough it is to be a woman, not just in our dimension, but in every parallel dimension as well. The quintessentiality of womanhood is defined as a lady here with martini glasses and high heels in the background. I mean, it's not a good cover. It's a bad cover. It undersells just, or actually maybe that's the whole point. Joanna Russ's whole deal of like, can't womanhood be defined by anything else, please? And then finally, I picked this up at Powell's City of Books, famously the largest independent bookstore in all the United States, maybe the world. It's such a huge bookstore. And I got this, Kitakini, A Tale of Magic. I didn't even know that she wrote a children's novel. Written especially for the Daughters Publishing Company, Kitakini, A Tale of Magic imagines how much more happily girls would grow if the tests of bravery, skill, risk-taking, and adventure were as easily available to them as domesticity and husbands. This novel is illustrated, and the illustrations are bad. Like, really bad. It's awesome, though. I'm excited to read this. Okay, final section. Gene Wolfe, who's one of my absolute favorites. I found a lot of Gene Wolfe. Starting off 2 copies of The Fifth Head of Cerberus. This is maybe his most famous novel. I've read Fifth Head of Cerberus, but I gave my copy away to a friend. Most copies of Fifth Head have the ugliest covers, and these have only kind of ugly covers. Fifth Head of Cerberus is actually a set of 3 novellas. He wrote the original novella, Fifth Head of Cerberus, and then he wrote 2 more novellas that take place in the same world, that expand and deepen the meta plot of the 3 stories. It takes place on these dual planets out in the stars that a couple of generations ago, the indigenous shape-shifting alien peoples were colonized by the darkest, most horrible, most devious force in the universe, the French. No. Is it possible that these shape-shifting aliens were so good at assimilating into this colonialist structure that they are the ones who are around still perpetrating these colonial structures and they don't even know it? Next up, The Devil in the Forest. This is what he wrote a couple of years after Fifth Head of Cerberus. I think he wrote that, then Peace, which is his literary fantasy story. And then he wrote Devil in a Forest, which is a novel that nobody talks about. This is a really rare novel, so I don't know anything about it except it takes place in the Middle Ages and it's about the interplay between paganism and Christianity. So I'm very excited to find a copy and to crack into it. Free Live Free. This is the novel he wrote after Book of the New Sun. It's much more comic than the usual Gene Wolfe novel, right? And it takes place in the modern day. I don't know. I'm excited to learn more. I finally found Shadow of the Torture by Gene Wolfe. This is the first edition paperback. I found books 2 through 4 in different places, usually for very cheap, but this first one, Shadow of the Torture, has been very elusive to me. I mean, it makes sense. It's literally one of the greatest covers of all time. You have Don Mates, very famous fantasy illustrator and husband to Janny Wurts, just drawing Severian standing on a platform. The platform doesn't really make sense, but it's so cool. And so it became iconic. I got the Tor edition paperback of Earth of the New Sun. Earth of the New Sun is the epilogue coda sequel to Book of the New Sun, which explains a lot of the mysteries. And it has some really cool stuff, and it has some really weird stuff as well. I have Soldier of Arete. This is the second of his Soldier in the Mist duology. This is Gene Wolfe's tribute to Herodotus. It is about a soldier who is formerly of the army of Xerxes. He gets bonked on the head or something, gains anterograde amnesia, which is to say he can't make new memories, but he also has retrograde amnesia. Every time he lays down to go to sleep, he forgets everything. And so the book is a set of scrolls where he writes down his daily encounters with all of these weird characters around ancient Greece. And the main thing about getting bonked on the head, he uniquely has the ability to see all of the different gods. Since he's not ethnically Greek, he doesn't know who they are. You have all of these different mythological characters showing up, but they will be referred to in very oblique ways. And it's fun trying to piece together what is going on with them, not to mention the fact that he forgets huge portions of the plot, and it's up to you, the reader, to try to keep it straight. This is just the duology in one collection. You can see that I am reading through Soldier of Arete right now. I actually bought this for a friend because I gave him Soldier of the Mist, and I felt bad that I gave him the first book and not the second, and now I can give him the second in a matching edition. But speaking of Latro and the Mist, I did find Soldier of Sidon. This is the third book in the series that he wrote 20 years later. Wait. Oh, that's annoying. So the whole reason I bought this is because it matches with this one. But they're different proportions. That is so obnoxious. Why would they do this to me? Why would they do this to me personally? It's not gonna look good together. Why would they do this to me? So Soldier of Sidon, Gene Wolfe wrote this 20 years later, continuing Latro's adventures, but now he's down in ancient Egypt, so he is meeting a lot of Egyptian and African gods. Who is he? H. Rider Haggard? The annoying thing is this book kind of ends on a cliffhanger. I think it got nominated or won a World Fantasy Award, but it didn't do that well, and it takes so much research to write one of these books that Gene Wolfe never bothered getting around to writing a fourth one. And then he died. You have this original duology, which works together, and then you have this awkward third one that teases more adventures that never happened. And so I go back and forth about whether I want to read this third book or not, but I probably will one day, even though it doesn't go together. Couple more Gene Wolfes and then we're done. Endangered Species. This is most of his late 80s short stories. I haven't read any of these short stories, I don't think, just from browsing through them. I also got a copy of The Wolf at the Door, his posthumous collection. I think it was edited to be a companion to The Best of Gene Wolfe, which came out a decade ago, so I think it has a few more of his best stories, but it's mostly focused on collecting all of the different stories that just hadn't had a chance to be in a collection before he passed away. And then finally I have Castleview, which was part of an informal trilogy he wrote in between the Soldier series and Book of the Long Sun of There Are Doors, Castleview, and what's it called? Pandora by Holly Hollander. They are all books about fantastic elements infiltrating into the modern day, and it seems people don't really like them as much as the Solar Cycle or the Latro books because he's taking real literary swings. Anyway, that's everything I had to present to you for part 2. I'll record part 3 another time, but for you, it'll be in 4 seconds. Hello. Here is part 3. In this third part, we are going to be talking about fantasy series that I collected most of or the entirety of, and hopefully I can get through this much faster so that I have less to edit. I can just talk about 5 books in the span of 2 minutes, and hopefully I won't get distracted on one of my tangents, but that I cannot promise that. I literally cannot promise that. But I'll just jump right into it. I have been focusing on collecting all the Asalian books by the author formerly known as Michelle West. This is the initial duology, which sort of opens up this universe, Hunter's Oath and Hunter's Death. I think fans say that you can skip these because they're not actually that much related to the later books, and maybe the writing level isn't as refined as what she gets up to later. I say the author formerly called Michelle West because she is usually published as Michelle Segarra or Michelle Segarra West these days. She is a Canadian woman of Japanese descent who was writing all this epic fantasy in an era where not being white in the fantasy space would have been seen as a detriment and not a benefit, which I think is the common view today. Michelle Segarra West has been writing this series for 30 years. This is all of the second sub-series that I purchased. Let's see if I can present it in the vaguely correct order, because I was independently given books 1 and 3. We have The Uncrowned King, that's Sun Sword number 2. Sea of Sorrows, that's Sun Sword number 4. The Riven Shield, which is number 5. And then finally, The Sun Sword, which, would you believe it, is Sun Sword number 6. I then finally have the first 2 books of her House War subseries. That's the one that she was writing throughout most of the 2000s and 2010s. So The Hidden City and City of Night. So now I have every Asalian book up until 2010 or so. House War is interesting because it sets up an entirely new cast of characters, and it takes place before, during, and after the Sun Sword arc. So I think fans have to resist the temptation to do machete orders of like, no, this is the order you read them in. This is the order you read them in. But House War is all finished. And then immediately after House War, Michelle Segarra West was like, okay, can't wait to write the final arc that is going to wrap up this entire universe. And then she gets dropped by her publisher. Kids these days don't know who she is, which is a real shame because, again, people are primed to want to read more diverse authors than the generic white dudes that most people grew up reading. Fortunately, Michelle Segarra West was able to thread the needle, so to speak. A few years ago, she announced a Patreon. Die-hard fans of the series just pay her directly. That is funding her writing so that she can independently publish the last couple of books in the series. So anyway, I started collecting these because Michelle Segarra West seems like a very interesting author, and I would want to do a deep dive on her in the future, maybe once I'm done with all the Janny Wurts that I'm reading. It would be really cool to catch up with the whole series by the time she finishes Assalian for good in, 5 years or something. Next up is the Trillium series. This first book, Black Trillium, is written by Marion Zimmer Bradley, Julian May, and Andre Norton, who are three of the most dominant women science fiction and fantasy writers in the late 20th century. Marion Zimmer Bradley wrote The Mists of Avalon, which is the quintessential feminist King Arthur. She is also hard canceled now. You can look into that. Discussion of her has really minimized over the last few years, and for good reason, don't get me wrong. Julian May wrote the Saga of the Pliocene Exiles sci-fi epic, which I'm very intrigued to read, and then Andre Norton did Witch World, and then literally 10 million other excellent sci-fi books. And I guess the idea of Black Trillium was that the three of them would write this first novel about three princesses who are going on a quest, and then each of them would write a sequel novel. So we have Blood Trillium by Julian May, we have Golden Trillium by Andre Norton, and then we have Lady of the Trillium by the bad woman. I purchased these because I saw all of them together and I thought like, okay, I know Bradley is canceled, but I think there is enough going on with these other two authors that it would still be worth checking out. And so I buy the 4 books, and then I realized there's 5 books. Julian May actually wrote a second book of her own that finishes the whole saga called Sky Trillium, so now I just feel really dumb. I got the entirety of Jennifer Roberson's Chronicles of the Chesley. There's 8 books in the saga, but I got the omnibus editions because I really enjoyed the colored pencil art of Yvonne Gilbert. She's the same woman who did the Little Big cover art that I use as the thumbnail for my top 15 videos. I just love the intricacy of her colored pencil work. I see these books everywhere, and the more I see books everywhere, the more I think, oh, this must be a really important series that I just haven't looked into yet. Oh, I showed book 2 first. I'm sorry. Anyway, this is Omnibus 1, Shape Changer's Song, then Children of the Lion, and finally, The Lion Throne. So this is a fantasy series based around, as you can guess, a race of shapeshifters and all of their adventures and whatnot. I collect books when I see them everywhere, and if I see them around enough, it kind of memes me into wanting to get them, even if the books don't seem good. And the most obvious example of that is this next series, which is The Circle of Light by Neil Hancock, beginning a great new saga for all who love Lord of the Rings. Actually, I think it came out in 77. I think it might be the same year as Thomas Covenant and Shannara. These covers are just so janky. This second one is particularly... It sounds like I'm disrespecting. I guess I am disrespecting a little bit, but this is by... oh, what's his name? Besides doing these covers, actually is most famous for doing a ton of the Ballantines, including the ones that I was praising earlier in this video. Like, he did that Last Unicorn cover, he did Lilith by George MacDonald, Squaring the Circle by Neil Hancock. But anyway, these are just such bizarre covers that you know, I've seen them in dozens and dozens of stores, and they've just always fascinated me. So I thought, why the heck not? I might as well pick them up for fun and profit, because this half-price books, the one in Linwood, Washington, just also had this full set. I ended up getting his prequel quadrilogy, which sort of explains what all these characters were up to originally. Across the far mountain, the plains of the sea, on the boundaries of darkness, and the road to the Middle Islands. You just, you just got the little otters. Like, you have this dwarf man. The bear is barely taller than the dwarf, and that just doesn't make sense to me. I'm being a little mean, but I do appreciate this art. I genuinely do appreciate it. I can appreciate something and also find it very funny at the same time. Here's a few just completing series that I have already started collecting. The Lady of Hongalen and A Fall of Princess by Judith Tarr, which completes the Avarian Rising trilogy, except she wrote 3 more books later, so now there's 6 of them, whatever. I'm really interested in Judith Tarr. I have a copy of The Hound and the Falcon, which I want to do a video about sooner rather than later, which is her kind of like fantastical alt history of the Fourth Crusade. I picked up the original in the series, Hall of the Mountain King, just because the cover art was so cool. And this is all done by Robert Gould, who is the same artist who did a lot of the Elric books. And similarly, I picked up this book, Unicorn and Dragon by Lynn Abbey, solely because of the Robert Gould art. If Robert Gould did the cover art, then it must be a good book, right? I also own the Slavic-influenced fantasy novel by C.J. Cherryh, Rusalka. And so I picked up the 2 sequels as well, Cernavog and Evgeny. I feel like when C.J. Cherryh was writing these, it would have been very unusual to have drawn on such explicitly Slavic mythology. The rest of these books tie into King Arthur. I'm gonna say I'm moderately knowledgeable about King Arthur for an American, and then a lot of British people will come into the comments and say, no, you aren't. I'm like, okay. I'm interested in King Arthur, let's put it that way, because one of my best friends is maybe in the top 1% of lay Arthurian scholars in the United States. He knows everything there is about King Arthur. He has read all of the source materials and like the original French and whatnot. His influence over the years has gotten me interested in King Arthur. And so there's a rich history of reinterpretations of King Arthur in fantasy. And I feel like I have to read them, so he doesn't have to. He's very particular about it. A box set of The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. Let's see what these covers are like, because these books were so good and such an iconic part of my childhood. And now you're discovering with me in real time how deeply ugly these covers are. Oversea and Under Stone, The Dark is Rising, Green Witch. This book's good. I think this is like low-key one of the best ones. The Grey King and Silver on the Tree. Dark is Rising is a children's meta series because the books are kind of unrelated at first and then she ties them together later on. Children in modern day Britain discovering different elements of Arthuriana and using them to sort of wage this great battle against cosmic evil. When I read it as a youth, it was just the most fundamentally British thing I had ever read. And in doing so, it really transported me to a different world. They made a movie out of it, though, in 2009 called The Seeker: The Dark is Rising, in the god-awful post-Harry Potter boom where they kept trying to throw other classic children's properties at the wall to see what would stick. The Dark is Rising is like a British kid learns about magic and he learns about the Wild Hunt and all of these other ancient pagan things. And then the movie is like, Will is just an American. He is the only cool kid at this boarding school for British weirdos. I hate British shit. I wish I was eating a hamburger. Yeah, I am the chosen one. And it's so awful. And the main villain is played by Christopher Eccleston. What a disaster. I don't even know if he says anything. I have 2 of the 3 Leoness books. Leoness is like adjacent to Arthurian lore. It figures prominently in Cornish mythology, I believe, and it just trickled into Arthuriana. But Jack Vance, who is known for the excellent Dying Earth science fantasy series, this is his one like actual epic fantasy trilogy. So we have Green Pearl and Maduke, but I have yet to find Sudrun's Garden, aka Lioness. It gets published under both titles, which is the first in the trilogy, but I am really excited to read those. The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart. Besides Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, the canceled Marion Zimmer Bradley, this is maybe the most award-winning and influential Arthurian reinterpretation of the late 20th century. It won a lot of awards in the early 80s, I think, because it's focused more on Merlin and his life. I got The Last Enchantment, which is the 3rd in the trilogy, and The Wicked Day, which is the 4th in the trilogy. Notice how I am missing the 2nd in this 4-book, actually I think maybe technically 5-book trilogy. Like, authors need to stop making trilogies and then making additional books in a trilogy, because then it throws everyone off. The King's Name by Joe Walton. Probably the most consistent literary fantasy author working today. I recently read her novel Tooth and Claw, and that was awesome. I also got King Arthur's Daughter, which is the sequel to... No, please, no. The sequel to The King's Damosel, which is the original YA source material for Quest for Camelot. You think I watched Princess and the Goblin a lot? Let me tell you, I watched Quest for Camelot way more than that. Quest for Camelot's awesome, dude. All the musical numbers, I am absolutely obsessed with Gary Oldman's musical number. He plays like, Ruba, I'm the knight of being evil. He has this like eye tick, which I guess is cool as like an animation quirk, but they really overdo it. So every time they cut to him, he's doing this. He has a song and he like can't sing for shit. The opening line is, I have a plan. It includes you. And it's like, yeah, I'm sure Kaylee is included in the plan. That's why you're singing this song to her. Now watch me create my mechanical army with pride. I cannot talk about Quest for Camelot anymore. I recently purchased The Dragon and the Unicorn by A.A. Attanasio, who also wrote Radix. This is apparently like one of the most unhinged Arthurian reinterpretations. Expansive cosmology of demons and angels and Atlanteans and whatnot. I found all the sequels to Dragon and the Unicorn. Wolfe and the Crown, The Eagle and the Sword, and then finally The Serpent and the Grail. Obviously, it bothers me that this is a trade paperback while the rest are mass markets, but I have no idea if I will ever find the mass market paperback for this, because this series seems rare enough as is, so why not? Next up, I got the Pendragon Cycle by Stephen R. Lawhead. This is another influential late 20th century Arthurian reinterpretation. Also pretty focused on Merlin. This first book, Taliesin, is about Merlin's dad, again in Atlantis. Always, all of these books are about Atlantis. I guess it's a really cool ancient thing to draw on that is somewhat agnostic to other mythological traditions. We have Taliesin, Merlin, Arthur, Pendragon, and then finally Grail. And he made a 6th one. People need to stop writing additional books and trilogies and pentalogies, please. It was only after I picked up all these books that I learned that this series actually got adapted into a streaming TV show earlier this year by, can you guess who? That's right, the Daily Wire. Ben Shapiro's right-wing news platform, which I guess is also getting into the streaming service game. That's so annoying to me. From what I understand, Stephen R. Lawhead is a religious conservative. I've read a lot of great fantasy books by religious conservatives, right? Like R.A. Lafferty, Gene Wolfe, etc. But Daily, come on, man. Did Shapiro just show up with a sack of money and say, like, the Judeo-Christian values of your book will be very important to protect the West? Like, seriously? Fuck off. Anyway, that's all the books I have. And now I'll talk to you later. Hello, this is part 4, which is miscellaneous fantasy novels and whatnot. I'm jumping right in. I gotta leave for a screening of The Naked Gun in 1 hour, so, hopefully that'll keep me on track. Famous last words. First, I want to include an author who I kind of forgot to include in the last part, Jane Gaskell, who is an author I am very intrigued with and want to make a video about. She was a British author who wrote a lot of sword and sorcery in the 1960s, going into the 1970s, the Atlan saga, of which I now have 4 out of the 5. Well, it's a complicated question. I'll talk about that in a second. The Serpent, the Dragon, Atlan, Book 3, and then The City, which says it's also Book 3. Wait, what the heck? Well, here's the thing. When The Serpent was originally released, it was just one thick book. And so later editions of the series have it split into 2 different novels called The Serpent and the Dragon. But when you're shopping for Jane Gaskell, they don't tell you whether this is the full novel or not. It's kind of impossible to know whether this is the full original story or whether this is half of the original story. And so by getting The Serpent and the Dragon together in one edition, I can now say, okay, I have both of these. I now have the entire original story. And so Atlan was the original 2nd book, but now it's the 3rd book. And then The City is now book 4, but when it was originally published, it was book 3. Does that make sense? Is that sensible to you? Anyway, there's only one more in the series that I need. Hopefully I can find it soon. And then also, I'm really glad that I was able to find this. Strange Evil. This is her original novel, which she wrote at the age of 14. I think she got it published when she was 17 or 18. I don't know much about it. I know that this book is highly praised by everyone who's ever read it. China Miéville of Perdido Street Station fame said that it was one of the 10 greatest weird fiction novels of all time. I am very happy that I can dive into this someday, and then I can share my findings with you about Jane Gaskell and her work. I got a copy of The Lions of Alrason by Guy Gavriel Kay. I love this cover. It's gorgeous. Guy Gavriel Kay, I'm saying Guy instead of Guy. I don't know if that's correct. He is known for doing all these fantasy novels, which are thinly veiled representations of different historical time periods. Tigana, his most famous book, is set in an analog for Renaissance Italy. I've tried reading Tigana several times and I've bounced off of it every time, which is crazy because he seems like an author who should be exactly up my alley. The Lions of Alrason is set in a analog for late medieval Spain, Reconquista era. You have people of these 3 different fantasy religions which correlate with Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. I love the interplay between these 3 religions. I always think it's a fascinating thing. Hopefully this will let me break into him. Myst, the Book of Atris. Remember the prequel novel to the best-selling PC game of all time as of 1996? Well, I do. I grew up playing all the Myst games. Yes, I was that kid. This was the first of the tie-in novels they made. I read all of them. I'm sure if I read it today, I would find that the prose or whatnot wasn't actually that good, but I'm still very attached to old Atris and his story. Jason, a novel by Henry Treece. And Henry Treece, known for doing this set of historical fantasy novels about the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England. I haven't found any of them, but I did find this. And I am separately fascinated with Jason and the Argonauts, and then you got old Medea right there. Did you say chicks? I bought this for the title and the cover, but it does seem like a really cool book. These chicks in chainmail are back, and they are not amused. This is just a collection of humorous sword and sorcery stories entirely by women authors. Only Begotten Daughter by James Morrow. This guy was really big in the 1990s. You don't really hear him talked about as much anymore. He did a lot of speculative fiction, hyper-critical of Christianity, a Philip Pullman type. Only Begotten Daughter is, what if the child of God was born again, but it was a modern-day girl in New Jersey? I'm hoping it's a fun read. Next up is The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende, maybe the most foundational work of German fantasy. I finally read The Never-Ending Story last year, and I loved it. I kind of wish I read it as a child. I did read a lot of Cornelia Funke. The greatest thing in the entire world is the music video for The Never-Ending Story. The Never-Ending Story, sung by this guy with a Rod Stewart haircut named lmao. Turn around, look at what you see. And the fact that he literally like turns around, he's like looking away, that cracks me up so hard, dude. Oh yeah, so The Never-Ending Story, the famous 80s fantasy movie, only adapts the first half. That's the whole thing. The Hollywood adaptation didn't get to the interesting part of what if you have saved the fantasy world? What if you're in the post-game, so to speak? Everyone loves you. What happens next? And the answer is, you go mad with power. It's such a hard-hitting deconstruction of the wish fulfillment power fantasy, which unfortunately has become a dominant strain in modern fantasy, if isekai and lit RPG are any indication. In Unkindness of Ravens, I don't know anything about this. I just thought it had a cool vibe. An 11th century romance of magic and love. The Phoenix in the Mirror by Avram Davidson. Look at this cover, golly. This is based around the Roman poet Virgil, but it sort of takes place in a alternate universe where you have all of these occult or magic concepts. This does seem like a really cool book. There's technically sequels, but they seem even harder to find, so I don't know if I'll ever find them. Till We Have Faces by Clive Staples. No, I can't do that. In my Evangeline Walton video, I bully Clive Staples a lot. I genuinely feel really bad about that. And so I thought I should read more of his adult-oriented fiction. Till We Have Faces is probably his most acclaimed novel. It's a psychological reimagining of the Cupid and Psyche myth. They're motivated by actual human desires, and so it's fleshing out that myth and kind of giving a realistic take on it. Here's a fun one. I got not one, but two Book of the Dun Cows. Book of the Dun Cow is an award-winning 70s fantasy novel. Epic fantasy entirely with barnyard animals. All these roosters fighting against a basilisk. It's a really good book, and I recommend you read it, but I have gotten into the habit of buying literally every single copy that I find because it's always $2 or less. Giving it away to friends and whatnot. Am I unbalancing the Book of the Dun Cow economy by doing so? These are books 5 and 6 that I own right now. I could probably send them out to viewers. Who would like their own copy of Book of the Dun Cow? Hand thrifted by moi. Lynn Carter, as you've probably gathered from earlier in this video, was the curator of the Ballantine adult fantasy line. He also just wrote a ton of pulp science fiction and fantasy novels, and so generally I'd be trying to find books that are edited by Lynn Carter, aka Ballantine Adult Fantasies, and then I'll just find these probably not that great books for 50 cents each, and so I ended up buying like The Mind Wizards of Callisto. Yo, what if you fought dinosaurs in space? You know, it's just Flash Gordon. He's not trying to do high literature here. Also got Thongor, Against the Gods. Exciting science, sword, and sorcery in the tradition of Robert E. Howard and A. Merritt. Just looking up here, I just see more Lynn Carter's I picked up. Calipigia. Time War. There was only one man in eternity who could win civilization's ultimate battle if he learned how in time. These are kind of like two of the biggest works of 40s fantasy. Silverlock by John Myers Myers. That is his real name. I was kind of dumbfounded. I really like the back for this because it has a full poem in verse going through the entire alphabet in a way that summarizes the novel. M is for the Murgatroyds, desperately haunted. N is for Fair Namui, desperately wanted. Wait, Murgatroyd? Like Snagglepuss, you know? Oh, heavens to Murgatroyd! And then The Well of the Unicorn by Fletcher Pratt, if you remember from earlier, was one of the main collaborators of L. Sprague de Camp. Both of these seem like books that should be in the Ballantine adult fantasy line, but maybe they're just a little too pulp. Maybe they're a little too close to the Conan tradition. I accidentally picked up 2 copies of E Pluribus Unicorn by Theodore Sturgeon. Kurt Vonnegut satirized him in all of his books as Kilgore Trout. Anyway, this is just a collection of Theodore Sturgeon's fantasy short stories, but I cannot resist any book that has a unicorn on it. That is my weakness. One of my many weaknesses, I should say. Here are 2 of the 5 books. Actually, I think the first and final book in the, I don't remember the name of the series. I just call it the White Heart series by Nancy Springer. I don't really know much about this series, but you see them around a lot. And if there's lots of copies, it was popular. And if it was popular, then maybe it's good. Which isn't always true, by the way. Oh, speaking of popular and not good, I ended up getting books 2 and 3 of The Iron Tower. Dennis L. McKiernan. The Iron Tower is his trilogy from the early 80s, which was infamous for being the most shameless ripoff of the Lord of the Rings imaginable. We're talking late 70s, early 80s. This is the era of the Belgaria. This was the era of Shannara. This was when, in order to have a popular fantasy novel, you just ripped off Tolkien, right? He was the guy who ripped off Tolkien to the point where everyone said, okay, man, now you're going too far. Across Mythgar, the warriors of the light are amassing their final assault on the powers of dark. Men, elves, dwarves, and dowdy warros. You know what Mythgar translates to, right? Translates to Middle Earth. Really makes you think. These are books that I explicitly picked up because people told me to pick them up in YouTube comments. Thank you. Thank you for turning me on to these books. Rats and Gargoyles by Mary Gentle, who wrote Ash, A Secret History, a book that I like a lot. This seems to be more of a weird urban fantasy. On the description, the term rat lords appears multiple times, and that's cool. Pat Murphy, The Falling Woman. This is a novel about an archaeologist encountering Mayan ghosts, and I love Mayan culture and mythology. Finally, the kin of Eta are waiting for you. Pull quote. Exploring the interface between mysticism and feminism, the kin of Eta are waiting for you is the best yet in the newly emerging genre of women's fantasy fiction. This is technically a novel. It includes lots of philosophical and mystical themes. It has been called a love story, science fiction, Jungian myth, and utopian allegory. It takes place in the tradition of fine visionary novels. You know, it gives me real William Blake vibes, so that's cool. I like collecting novels from the 20th century that reinterpolate Japanese culture in ways that are seen as bad and tacky today. Scissors, cut paper, wrap stone. The cover is a monk with Darth Maul spider legs. Wait, you don't remember Darth Maul has spider legs now? He got it in a comic that nobody read. You don't remember that he has spider legs now? What are you, stupid? According to Neil Stevenson, author of Snow Crash, Cyberpunk's first lyrical poem mixing Kabbalah, manga, pop culture trivia, and Zen with enough style and dexterity to actually pull it off. McDonald does more in a page than most writers do in a chapter. I bought this book because it seems bad, but that is pretty high praise. Sword of the Demon. Through realms of oriental splendor and superhuman conflict, a beautiful woman warrior in a fierce man-god journey to challenge a being more awesome than the gods for a magical sword that holds the power of death and the key to enlightenment. And then the rest of these are books by Jessica Amanda Salmonson, who was a very prominent writer in the 80s, and most of her books brought in Japanese culture in some way. She's mostly famous for the Tomoe Gozen trilogy, of which this is the second novel, the last one that I needed. But then she also wrote these other books like The Swordswoman. What if you were attacked by aliens, but you, a white girl, happened to be a master of kendo, so you could fight off all the aliens with your katana skills. Yeah! Olu Ken and the Beautiful Madwoman. This seems to be classical China instead of Japan. Interested in seeing what she does with this. And then finally, her short story collection, A Silver Thread of Madness, where a young girl's obsession for samurai movies becomes the ultimate ticket to death. What? Jessica Amanda Salmonson and liking katanas? You don't say! Gildenfire by Stephen R. Donaldson. You wouldn't call it a picture book, but this is an illustrated hardcover novel that takes place during his Thomas Covenant saga. But it's not focused on our favorite worst man alive, Thomas Covenant. It's focused on this warrior dude instead. This one's crazy. Louisa the Poisoner by Tanith Lee. Tanith Lee of the Flat Earth series, an author who I really want to get more into. I love this. I love this. A short historical fantasy about a girl entering high society. Her aunt teaches her, you know the best way to rise up through society? Marrying rich dudes and poisoning them. These are non-fiction books with a literary bent. The White Goddess by Robert Graves. Robert Graves is most famous for writing I, Claudius and Claudius the God. He also wrote a lot of mythological non-fiction. This is his most famous work of such, where he posits that there is a great matriarchal feminine being underlying all of the different mythologies of Europe, and that this feminine principle has kind of been covered up by subsequent patriarchal mythology. Almost everything he wrote in this book has since been disproven or debunked by later scholars. It's still interesting to look at in terms of the history of mythological studies. If you want a fun way to spend an afternoon, read Robert Graves' Wikipedia page. This man was the single most chaotic bisexual. The Lost Continent of Mu, speaking of work that has since been debunked. James Churchward didn't invent the theory, but he popularized the theory that there used to be a giant continent in the Pacific Ocean called Mu. He was sort of drawing on earlier mythology about Lemuria. This is a lot of ancient alien stuff. Why are there these analogs between Indian and Polynesian and Hispanic culture? There must have been some sort of original Atlantis-like civilization that they all kind of descended from. Modern Fantasy, The 100 Best Novels by David Pringle. If you want to ask me like how I know a lot about fantasy and stuff, this book is a big source of it. David Pringle, so he starts in 1948. He starts with Titus Groan, I believe, by Mervyn Peake. So he starts just a little before Lord of the Rings, and then he goes through the mid-80s. The scope is unfortunately a little limited by only looking at the 40s through the 80s when the fantasy boom happened, and then he sort of says these are the 100 best literary fantasy novels from that time period. Look, Phoenix in the Mirror by Avram Davidson. I only bought that book because I had previously read this in a library, and he said it was a good book, so that's what put it on my radar, stuff like that. Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials, Barlow's Guide to Fantasy, both of which are guidebooks that are written by Wayne Douglas Barlow, who was an illustrator. Each entry is a character or a monster from a classic fantasy novel, like this is the titular King of Elfinland's daughter. Very inventive takes on the characters. I especially love this Barlow's Guide to Fantasy because every single character represented is from one of these interesting, deep-cut 20th century fantasy novels that I love so much. The Extraterrestrials one is interesting, but I recognize almost none of the books in the series. I know the authors, but they're all these different space operas from the 1940s and whatnot that I haven't read. As a little bonus at the end, I have God's Demon by Wayne Barlow. This is the prose novel that he wrote. This doesn't have any illustrations or whatever. But this is a favorite novel by the YouTuber Bookpilled, who is my favorite booktuber and a huge inspiration to me. He esteems this book, and he's one of the few people whose opinion I trust, even when he disagrees with me. Okay, that's the end of this part. Bye. Hello, we are back for part 5, which is science fiction. But before I get into that, I have to mention one fantasy novel that I forgot to mention the last time I recorded, The Escapement, Book 3 of the Engineer Trilogy by K.J. Parker. K.J. Parker is the alter ego of British author Tom Holt, who wrote a lot of satirical fantasy in the 1980s and the 1990s. You could really say he was part of the same generation as Terry Pratchett, but for whatever reason, his satirical fantasy didn't catch on as much in the United States as Pratchett's did. This is Who's Afraid of Beowulf and expecting someone taller. I guess because the Tom Holt name was so thoroughly associated with this humorous fantasy, he took on the name K.J. Parker to write stuff that was much bleaker, still funny in its own way. These truly grimdark novels. In modern fantasy communities, he is most famous for the trilogy 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City, but he had been writing as K.J. Parker since the 2000s, but a lot of those 2000s books are pretty hard to find, which is why I previously picked up the first 2 entries of the Engineer Trilogy. They are way up on that shelf. I cannot reach them where I'm at right now. So you'll just have to believe me. And now I have the full set. So I am hoping to read more KJ Parker soon because what I've read of him has been excellent. Now let's get into the actual sci-fi. First off, these are just 2 collections that my cousin gave me because his stepfather is involved in the sci-fi indie press scene. Trench Coats, Towers and Trolls, Cyberpunk Fairy Tales, as well as Reckoning 5, creative writing on environmental justice. I'm not really that involved in the contemporary scene, especially the small press scene. So it's really nice to have a way to break into that now. Maybe I'll learn some contemporary small authors rather than just all these dead people from the 70s that I love so much. Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. A classic of the genre, sort of about how Catholicism perpetrates itself in the post-apocalypse in an era when most of human culture is lost. I read it a while back. I wasn't that crazy moved by it, but it feels like something I should really love. So I do want to give it another chance. Dune by Frank Herbert. You know what this is. I just picked this up because this is an OG, what is it, Berkeley? I have the Berkeley science fiction paperbacks of Messiah and Children of Dune, and now they make the set. I got the book club edition of God Emperor of Dune. God Emperor of Dune is one of those few books where I'll try to find as many copies as I can. This is only my 3rd, to be clear. I'm not going overboard. But how many ways can you represent this worm man who wants to die, right? Like, every cover of God Emperor is super funny. It's so funny. The more covers I own, the more I laugh. I can't believe I found this in a store. Edison's Conquest of Mars by Garrett P. Service. I was turned on to this by Michael J. Nelson, formerly of Mystery Science Theater fame. His podcast, 372 Pages We'll Never Get Back, where they just read lots of terrible, terrible literature, mostly focusing on the works of Ernest Cline, because Ready Player One is terrible. Edison's Conquest of Mars, it was written in 1898. It is what is called an Edisonade, which was a short-lived subgenre of science fiction where back when Thomas Edison was the Elon Musk of his day, and I don't mean current perceptions of Elon Musk, I mean 2010s like, whoa, he's hecking Iron Man. He's gonna bring us to Mars. I've never been a Musk fan, to be clear, but a lot of people were. This is an unauthorized sequel to H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, where Thomas Edison is so fed up with the fact that Martians invaded the Earth in the first place that he goes to their planet and he uses all of his whiz-bang technology to genocide all of them. Or should I say xenocide all of them? Okay, double feature. The Demolished Man and The Stars, My Destination, both by Alfred Bester. These are his two most famous novels. I've only read The Stars, My Destination, formerly called Tiger, which is about a blue-collar working man who gets trapped out in space. He gets abandoned by the faceless sci-fi company that he works for, and so he swears to get revenge. And he's like, Gully Foyle is my name, and revenge is my game. He really is just like Jason Statham. Do you want to read a Jason Statham sci-fi revenge novel based off of the Count of Monte Cristo? It's also where Stephen King took the idea of jaunting from. If you know, you know. And then I don't really know anything about The Demolished Man. It might be proto-cyberpunk. Inherit the Stars by James P. Hogan. I recommended this in my top 15 sci-fi video. And now I have it. I have a copy of my own. I don't have to use the library anymore. Inherit the Stars, as far as I know, basically invented the genre of xenoarchaeology. What if we had an archaeological adventure in space? And so I picked up The Engines of God, which is the first of many books by Jack McDevitt. And Jack McDevitt made his entire career out of archaeological adventures in space, right? You have Priscilla Hutchins, who I guess is some intrepid adventurer along the lines of Indiana Jones, finding space ruins and what's the mystery at the heart of these space ruins, and she figures them out. And then if you like that, then you can read 9 more with the exact same plot. So I hear Jack McDevitt's good, but if you read all of his works, it gets samey after a while. Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover. I have come to love Matthew Stover just from reading a bit of Heroes Die, which is a genius book that I will be talking about in the channel in the future. And he also wrote novelization for Revenge of the Sith, which a lot of Star Wars fans hold as like one of the greatest Star Wars novels, because while maintaining literally everything that happens, he is able to insert enough character depth and psychological realism that the events of the movie make sense, that it's actually a good story and not just a series of plot beats that George Lucas came up with. Celestial Matters by Richard Garfinkel, a novel of alternate science. I kind of hear that the actual plot of this is a little ho-hum, but I've been seeking it for a long time because of its premise. A version of Earth where Ptolemaic science still hold true. The Earth is made up of fire, water, air, and earth. All of the ancient Greek conceptions of how science worked remain true into the modern day. Kind of similar to some of the short stories that Ted Chiang has done. Eiffelheim by Michael Flynn. Eiffelheim is a novel about archaeologists or whatever are trying to find out what happened to this medieval village that was ransacked by plague. Spoilers, it was aliens. What if you had an alien encounter in the Middle Ages? Edge of Tomorrow by, what's his name? Hiroshi Sakurazaka. The joke is, this isn't Edge of Tomorrow. This is the original Japanese novel, All You Need Is Kill, which got adapted into the Tom Cruise movie, Edge of Tomorrow, which the powers that be will tell you is called Live, Die, Repeat. But it's not called that. It's called Edge of Tomorrow. Anyway, so this is a Japanese novel that just has the least Japanese cover imaginable. And I find that very funny. Oh yes, Tom Cruise's character, Keiji Kiriya, of course. The Dark Lady by Mike Resnick, a romance of the far future. I don't know anything about this. I just picked it up due to the vibes. That's all. Greg Egan, Permutation City. Greg Egan is maybe the most beloved hard sci-fi novelist working right now. Greg Egan's whole thing is that he just writes these speculative worlds that have such difficult to comprehend scientific principles. You know, you kind of need a PhD to understand what's going on, but that's what his fans really find appealing about it. What if you lived on a microchip? That would be crazy. In the rare books room of Powell's City of Books, the largest independent bookstore in the United States, as they'll breathlessly tell you. I had to get something from the rare books room, but I wasn't going to buy the $300 Tekumel board game. Sorry. I got the 2069 trilogy by Larry Townsend, which is a trio of gay erotica science fiction novels. There's more 50s, 60s gay science fiction than you would think, right? Obviously, you have this guy, even though I can't find any information about him, because I think he was writing gay erotica first and foremost. This just happens to be science fiction. It's not like he wrote science fiction as a thing. William S. Burroughs, I think Samuel R. Delany would have been writing lots of gay erotica at the time. He didn't publish that until much later in his career. The back cover says that the tight, plodding, and shameless male sexual pleasure established him as one of gay erotica's first masters. This book came out in 1969. That tells you everything you need to know. The Golden Transcendence by John C. Wright. John C. Wright is this libertarian asshole. I'll say it, whatever. He's associated with sad puppies, but his original trilogy of sci-fi novels are supposed to be pretty good, but I mostly buy them for the meme. Every time John C. Wright has a picture taken for him, he's literally tipping a fedora "M'lady!" Culpa Imperial by Angelica Gorodisker, if I'm saying that right. Angelica Gorodisker is a very famous Argentine author of speculative fiction, maybe the next most famous Argentine author after Jorge Luis Borges. I'm going to say this confidently, and because I'm saying it confidently, it's probably wrong, but this is probably the most famous work of South American science fiction ever written. Literary space opera that is told from an interlocking set of short stories, which reminds me a lot of The Carpet Makers, and that's a good book, so this must be a good book. Also of particular note is that this is translated by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I find really intriguing. I don't think Le Guin speaks Spanish, so it might have been more abstract than that, Le Guin's translation of the Tao Te Ching. If Ursula Le Guin thinks that this is an incredible book that English speakers should read, I believe her. Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card, another book that I put on my top 15 sci-fi novels that I just didn't have a copy of myself, and now I do. Dragon's Egg by Robert L. Forward. Dragon's Egg has a reputation for being very difficult, very hard science fiction for when it was written. Oh, I'm saying 1980. Wow. It has a very robust usage of astrophysics in a way that other writers weren't using at the time. Robert Silverberg's Downward to the Earth. I recommended this in my top 15 video. It seems to be a book that's cursed with a lot of bad covers. The cover that I had is okay. No, it's not on that shelf. But I really like this more psychedelic, 1970s groovalicious cover, so I just picked this up as well. The Best of Lee Brackett. Lee Brackett is an author I advocate for, even though I haven't read that much of her work yet, because she was writing a lot of planetary romance, John Carter style novels in an era when women weren't writing those sorts of novels, like at all. She also wrote The Empire Strikes Back, the first draft, at least. So Lawrence Kasdan just rewrote her script after she died and claimed all of her ideas as his own. Robert A. Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Everything that I've read by Heinlein has been bad. Maybe this won't be bad. I don't know. This is like one of his most famous novels, so maybe it delivers. Isaac Asimov, The Caves of Steel. This is his sci-fi detective novel that technically takes place in both the robot and the Foundation universes simultaneously. I love Asimov, even though like all of his best stories are literally just two people in a room and one of them is just mansplaining concepts at the other one. Oh yeah, I love when some 50s dude speaks at someone else with an authoritative voice about galactic politics. So maybe this is a slightly different mode for Asimov. I saved the rarest for last. I got Dangerous Visions by Harlan Ellison. This is maybe the most famous sci-fi short story collection of all time. Harlan Ellison, the clown prince of science fiction, brilliant writer who is also kind of a mean guy, but because he could be like so blunt and angry, that means like when he liked you, you knew that he liked you. This is his famous collection where he went to a lot of authors and he said, what's the short story you can't sell because it's too weird or disturbing or progressive? I'm gonna put all of those in one collection so that you can get these stories out into the world that the mainstream sci-fi magazines won't let you. And that led to Dangerous Visions, and it was a huge hit. Dangerous Visions you can buy in modern bookstores, and I've been tempted to several times just to read it, but it is maybe one of the worst printed books I have ever encountered. Like, it's just on printer paper, right? And you touch the pages, I just recoil. Just the feel of the pages is repulsive. It is an evil edition, and the people who put it together should be ashamed. Samuel R. Delany, Fritz Lieber, Philip K. Dick, Theodore Sturgeon, Norman Spinrad, who's coming up soon, Lester Del Rey, Robert Silverberg, Roger Zelazny, R.A. Lafferty, J.G. Ballard, a lot of the hits. And then later, he made a sequel called, again, Dangerous Visions. The version I found was split up into 2 volumes, and I am fine with that. And this one, I think he wanted to go for more diversity. It has Ursula K. Le Guin, The Word for World is Forest, which is her, 6th Heinisch novel. It has the Joanna Russ story that ended up turning into The Female Man. Gene Wolfe, Ray Bradbury, Piers Anthony. And this one has, Thomas M. Dish, the author of The Brave Little Toaster. James Tiptree Jr., M. John Harrison. Yeah. And then last of all is the novel that I've been looking for forever because it seemed just absolutely hilarious, but it seems like a very in-demand novel. And that is The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad. The Iron Dream is a novel satirizing Nazism, kind of in the same vein as Mel Brooks. What if instead of becoming the Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler became a moderately successful science fiction writer who was just writing in New York in the 1950s, just in his tiny little apartment. And so this pretends to be sci-fi writer Adolf Hitler's final novel, The Lord of the Svastika. So this novel is supposedly Hitler's like a really crappy power fantasy writ large, and it just seems like a real hoot. Harry Harrison says, if Wagner wrote science fiction, this is the way he would do it. All right, and that's everything. Pew, 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 pew. One more part. I think I might just record it right now just to get it over with. And then I can be done. Golly. Hello, once more into the breach. This is part 6, talking about capital L literature, mostly the stuff that didn't fit into the conventional genre categories that I've already covered. Hopefully there will be no more reasons for me to tangent about obscure animated fantasy musicals of the 1980s. Or is there? I mean, we got Princess and the Goblin, but what about Goblin Market? It's the poems and prose of Christina Rossetti. Christina Rossetti wrote my single favorite poem of all time, Goblin Market, which is about 2 Victorian sisters trying to fend off these freakish little goblins. And it's supposed to be this like Victorian morality fable, but it's way too gay and horny for what you would expect for something from that time period. Christina Rossetti is an interesting figure. She was the younger sister, I think, of Dante Rossetti, who was a prominent figure in the pre-Raphaelite art movement. But I'll be real, outside of Goblin Market, I don't know much of her other work, so I'm really excited to dive into this in the future. I was recently reading A Room of Her Own by Virginia Woolf. Or is it called A Room of One's Own? 500 pounds a year, that's all a woman needs to be independent. That's what she argues. 500 pounds in a room of her own. Anyway, in that essay, she talks extensively about how Christina Rossetti is just one of the greatest poets who's ever lived. I already like Christina Rossetti, but hearing Virginia Woolf sing her praises made me even more interested in reading her other work. Next up is Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges. I recommended this in my top 15 fantasy video. The greatest short stories I have ever read in one very slim volume. Reading through it will change your life, probably. I have the complete prose fictions of Borges, this giant tome, and so it's just nice to have Ficciones by itself in a little volume that I can lend out to friends. Okay, up next, Bob Honey Who Just Do Stuff by Sean Penn. This is another book that Mike Nelson covered on 372 pages. We'll never get back. This is Sean Penn's vanity project, his attempt to do high literature. It just seems so miserable. Like he thinks that excessive amounts of alliteration counts as good writing. Me and all my buddies, we now all have our own copies, so we're gonna do a book club. We're calling ourselves the Honey Boys. I'm just a little honey boy. Oh wait, no, but like not like Shia LaBeouf or whatever. An almost literally up to the minute fever dream of a novel. That's a pull quote from Bill Maher. New rule. If you are an actor who has a reputation for being smug and unlikable, how about you advertise your book by getting the only man in America more smug and unlikable than you are to advertise for you? Okay. Yeah, fuck that guy. Next up is Baudolino by Umberto Eco. I love Umberto Eco. The Name of the Rose is one of my favorite novels of all time. In Baudolino, it's this absurd rendition of late medieval history, starting with the sack of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade. You're following this like Italian guy named Baudolino as he goes on various adventures. I want to make a video about this book specifically in the future because I think it ties into other literature that I would also want to cover. Woo 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 woo. Baha'u'llah and the New Era, an introduction to the Baha'i faith. Baha'i is so interesting. It's like a blend of Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, all of these different faith traditions into one, and I want to know more about it. The Confessions of the Lady Nijo, translated from the original Japanese by Karen Brazel. I love medieval Japanese literature. I count The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon as one of my absolute favorites. I purchased this because I wasn't familiar with the Confessions of Lady Nijo. By glancing through the introduction, it seems that the manuscript was only uncovered in Japan in like the 1960s. The diary of a court woman and maybe the Muromachi period as she gets up to some torrid affairs. So it seems like a real spicy read. The Game of Kings, a novel by Dorothy Dunnett. This is the first of her, the Lyman Chronicle. This is one of the great epic historical works of the late 20th century. I think she wrote 6 of these books as well as a bunch of prequels. It's following this Scotsman going around the court of like Catherine de Medici or something, and he gets up to adventures. Speaking of iconic works of historical fiction, I also got 2 of the Horatio Hornblower books by C.S. Forester, Hornblower During the Crisis, and Beat to Quarters. I love the Horatio Hornblower miniseries starring Ian Griffith, and it would be fun to read the Aubrey Maturin series one day too, you know, The Master and Commander and whatnot. Dostoevsky. This is notes from Underground, as well as a couple of his other shorter works. I haven't read much Dostoevsky. Obviously, I want to work my way up to Brothers Karamazov. Notes from Underground is one of the funniest books I've ever read. It's Dostoevsky as an author, annoyed with this cultural trope at the time. The reason society exists is because human beings always act in their own best self-interest. So this is how we have good human relations for the most part, right? Being nice to other people leads to other people being nice to you, and you can build society, etc. Dostoevsky writes Notes from the Underground of like, what if there was a guy who did things not in his own self-interest, who just acted like a maniac, who just gets into these like one-sided fights with people, makes a complete fool of himself, and it's hysterically funny. At least I find it hysterically funny. It's cringe humor, right? You know what it is? It's literally just like reading a couple of I Think You Should Leave sketches, but set in 1800s Russia. The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. I don't know Nikos Kazantzakis that well, but he is one of the most famous Greek literary authors of the 20th century. He also did Zorba the Greek. But I love The Last Temptation of Christ, the Scorsese movie, one of my absolute faves of all time. So I am happy to have this book, and hopefully I can get to it sometime. Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. I haven't read any of him, but Dead Souls is his most famous book, which is a satire of Tsarist Russia. Dead Souls describes the gambits of a quixotic opportunist in provincial Russia who sets out to buy deceased serfs at a low cost from their owners. Chichikov requires evidence of property since he wishes to marry an heiress and is able to amass the souls because their owners must pay taxes on them until they are officially declared dead in the rolls of the next census. The bureaucratic nonsense of Tsarist Russia. Black Rain by Masaji Ibuse. This is a book I read during undergrad. Absolutely beautiful and heart-wrenching work about survivors of Hiroshima. It takes place well after the bomb, but you have these people who are like trying to settle back into normal life, but radiation poisoning just slowly starts to manifest itself. You have this woman who wants to get married, but she has to obscure the fact that like clumps of her hair are falling out because like no one wants to romance someone who is dying of radiation poisoning, and it's just so heartbreaking. It got turned into an excellent movie in 1989, I think, and unfortunately a really shitty Michael Douglas movie also called Black Rain, also set in Japan, came out the same year, where he's like, I have to beat up every Yakuza, and I'm cooler than the Yakuza at what they do. Time to have sex with Glenn Close. Well, he doesn't do it in that movie, but he does it in every other movie he made in the 80s. Carlos Castaneda, Journey to Ixtlan, The Lessons of Don Juan. I bought this at my cousin's recommendation. I wasn't really familiar with this guy, but basically this dude made a career writing these books about his meetings with this like desert shaman in Mexico, I believe. Yaqui Indian spiritual leader Don Juan Matus. This spiritual leader teaches him about peyote and teaches him about the spirit realm and whatnot. But the controversy about this book is that it's kind of uncertain whether Don Juan was an actual dude who Carlos Castaneda was hanging out with, or whether Carlos kind of made it all up. The Wikipedia article says, like, originally released as nonfiction. Even if it's made up, you know, it still teaches you a lot of cool stuff about peyote, right? Okay, now for the big one. My Struggle, Book 1 by Karl Ove Knausgård. And Book 2, and Book 3, and Book 4, 5, and 6. Oh god. So Knausgård is the meme Norwegian writer of the last 20 years, right? Started writing this series in the late 2000s, early 2010s. It's just this absurdly long autobiography, nearly 4,000 pages long, where he talks about every single thing that ever happened in his life in this hyper granular detail. But because he's like such a good writer, he was so good at replicating the minute moments of daily life, replicate the pleasure of holding a teacup in a way that seemed grand and magnificent. Maybe like Marcel Proust in that way. But then the other thing that made the series so addicting to people is how he would just dish tea about everyone he has ever met, talking about his father's alcoholism, but talking about like friends, family, not holding anything back, just writing out all their dirty laundry just because he's like telling every single thing that ever happened to him. As he's writing the books, the Norwegian press is like trying to track down all these family members to be like, is it true what he wrote about you? And then the later books are about people he knows coming up to him and saying like, what the hell, you made me look like a huge asshole. And then he's like, I'm just writing the book. Final book. Another one that I have been looking for a while, and that is 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, which I think is universally agreed to be the best Chilean novel of the 21st century. If you're looking at top books of the 21st century, this is often in the top 20 or even the top 10. This was the last book that Roberto Bolaño was working on before he died. It is technically unfinished. He wrote it all out, but he was still in the process of editing it, but it's not like it just ends on a cliffhanger, I think. This book is so heavy, dude. I'm like trying to hold it with one hand, but this is a super dense, super like postmodern examination of the systematic murder of women by cartels in Ciudad Juarez. So this is like a bad vibes book, to put it simply. Examining really horrific social problems from a wide variety of angles, but it just seems to be one of those books that changes your life forever. This is my final book. If I counted right, this is number 208. Golly, and now I can put these on my shelf, on my newly organized shelves, and I will be able to find all these books going forward. Thank you so much for sitting through the world's longest vlog, which is going to take me even longer to edit. I don't know. I literally don't know if a single human being alive will actually like make it to the end of this bad boy. But if you did, thank you. I love you.